What is exactly the meaning of communion? It's been central to the worshiping life of Christians back to the very beginning. Eucharist, communion, the Lord's Supper are different words to describe the ritual of Thanksgiving that formed around shared meals in early Christian homes. It didn't start in churches. Remember, the early Christians met in homes and they shared meals. And Jesus and his followers were Jewish. And the Gospels report the first communion as a Passover feast, which is 1 Corinthians. The language of the traditional communion rites often follows most closely on the passage we have just read. Communion literally means sharing. It's breaking bread together. It is fellowship. Communion is supposed to bring everyone together as one body. And this was the focal point of the early church's weekly experience. If you go to Acts 20, verse 7, it indicates that on the first day of the week, the church at Troas came together to break bread. In 1 Corinthians 11:18, Paul writes to the Corinthians about when you come together as a church, adding that they come together to eat the meal. And Paul is describing the church's regular assembly. And from this, it appears that the early church communed every single week, not monthly or quarterly or annually, as many churches do today. We Methodists, there are many Methodist churches, and some Methodist churches have communion every week. Others, like us, have once a month, and others still have once a quarter. And it seems that we have gone away from what John Wesley suggested in his sermon, The Duty of Holy Communion. He said we should commune as often as we can, because it is a reminder of what has come for us. It is a reminder that we need God's grace. It is a reminder that through communing with God, often we are graced for the living of our days. So maybe we should change communion and have it every week. What do you think?
No.
Raise hands? Raise hands? No takers? Of course, tradition. Again. Of course, you don't have to be in church for long to realize that instead of uniting around the Lord's Supper, many Christians, including Methodists, have divided over it. Those who want to have it once a quarter, those who want to have it every week, those who don't want to have it at all, and those who want to have it in a special place over there, that doesn't interrupt with the service. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The debate focuses on what the meal means. We have debated that for a long time. How often it should be taken, and who should partake in it. Some churches say, well, only baptized people should take communion. Others say, well, children should not take communion. Others say, well, children should take communion. And us Methodists say the table is open. Anybody can take communion, even people who are not from our faith, because of the understanding we have of it. But it is important to note that the words, I remember the words etched in the communion table when I was a child. I remember those words were etched, and I've served in churches where those words were etched at the communion table that says, "Do this in remembrance of me." It doesn't say, "Debate this," right? It doesn't say, "Debate this." But when we move beyond Christ's command and debate various theological nuances about the supper, we move toward disunity. And Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians, when speaking of sharing the bread as the body of Christ, because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. One bread, one body. And yet, my only Protestant uncle, who lovingly went to Mass with my Catholic aunt every Sunday, was never, ever allowed to take communion together with her. One bread, one body. And yet my Catholic brother cannot take communion because he is divorced. One bread, one body. And yet my other Catholic brother cannot take communion because he has a stance pro-gay and lesbians. One bread and one body. And yet my Lutheran Missouri Synod colleagues denied my friend communion because she's not of their persuasion. Protestant reformers, Luther and Zwingli, argued bitterly and split over whether the bread and wine were the actual flesh and blood of Christ or merely symbolized his body and blood. An argument that persists today. And while we debate the finer, doctrinal points of the Lord's Supper, whether it is transubstantiation or consubstantiation or memorialism, etc., we often forget and even violate one of the most important aspects of the meal: church unity. And Paul criticizes the Corinthian Christians because they are abusing the Lord's Supper. They have come to observe communion, as a highly individualized, privatized matter. And he says, "For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry, and another becomes drunk." Paul also seems to be concerned that there were significant distinctions being made between rich and poor. "You show contempt for the church of God," he says, "and humiliate those who have nothing." It seems, as a commentator put it, that wealthy people at that church in Corinth were invited earlier for the choice food and drink. And the poorer Christians came later to find, along with tipsy co-worshippers, leftover food at best. Obviously, this violated the radical social vision of equality that Jesus continually promoted. So Paul, in this letter, calls each member of the Christian community at Corinth to self-examination before partaking of the Lord's Supper. Then, when they come together to eat as a church, he asks them to wait for one another and then to break bread together in explicit remembrance of Jesus. as he instructed at his own supper, Last Supper. The Corinthians' behavior contradicted the whole point of the communion experience. Rather than celebrating their unity, they were reveling their disunity, their division. Yes, we need to self-examine ourselves. Yes, we need to look at our hearts and see how we are doing with God and with our neighbor and with those who are around us. Maybe we have inflicted hurts and wounds, and we are called to mend those broken places in our lives, those disunities or divisions we have created. But what Paul here is talking about is this other manner in which people took communion. The concept of community is absolutely central to the ritual of communion. The idea of overcoming distinctions and barriers, the coming together as one body to share in the one bread. And Jesus came with a very clear understanding of human solidarity, which he symbolized again and again and again in the face of fear criticism, by breaking bread with tax collectors and sinners and outcasts, by breaking bread with the multitudes. He always got in trouble when he did that. Because Jesus didn't distinguish between rich and poor, male or female, Jew and Gentile. And I hope we don't do that today. Because this table of Holy Communion is Christ's table. This is not the table of the United Methodist Church or the table of our Saviour's congregation. It's not a meal in the clubhouse for members only. It is open to all, regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation, political persuasion, status, or church membership. CEOs and homeless beggars are the same in God's eyes. My dear brothers and sisters, communion is not just a matter of gathering in unity. It should also nourish us for an outpouring of love in the world. Jesus always did both. He gathered the community, he gathered those around him to break bread together, and then he didn't say, go your own way. No, then he sent them out. He sent them out to feed and clothe and comfort others. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Just as you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Communion has always been meant to be transformative socially as well as personally. In the 1st and 2nd century, there were meals that were prepared by Christians. And a presider would bless it and then would be given to the community. It would be given to the community, to those who were around, to the strangers. This meal that we have today isn't just simply my shot of grace, but it is your incorporation into, shall I say, the body, the church, for the world, for the sake of the world. That when Jesus comes to speak with us, so to say, and when Jesus comes to feed us, He comes to reconcile, to forgive, to feed, to empower us to be His body, His presence in the world, and be vulnerable to God's pain in the world. This is what communion is about. Communion is about a theology of presence. And that is so hard for us to understand sometimes. We fail to understand that we are called to be nourished here at the table, but then go out and nourish others and reach out to them. Catholic priest Henry Nouwen once wrote in a Eucharistic prayer the following. He said, "Dear Lord, isn't my faith in your presence in the breaking of the bread meant to reach out beyond the small circle of my brothers to the larger circle of humanity and to alleviate suffering as much as possible? If I can recognize you in the sacrament of the Eucharist, I must also be able to recognize you in the many hungry men, women, and children in the world. If I cannot translate my faith in your presence under the appearance of bread and wine into action for the world, I am still an unbeliever. I pray, therefore, Lord, deepen my faith in your Eucharistic presence and help me find ways to let this faith bear fruit in the lives of men." Amen. That's his prayer. Why? Why do you take communion? Why? I take communion because I am hungry for a place of radical acceptance, where the tragedies and hopes of life are confronted. I am hungry for the food that reminds me God's love is so abundant. It feeds, the whole world. I take communion because I have been hungry for the wrong things. Because I have wanted to name God all by myself, to exclude others, to feast on my own apathy and be left to my own devices. At the table, I am reminded of my hunger. At the table, I am reminded of the only one whose bread does not leave me empty. That's why I take communion. Why do you take communion? Why? It's an important question we need to ask ourselves and answer. May the time come when Christian communion is a true sharing. When Christians are united by this ancient ritual in remembrance of Jesus, rather than divided by it. When Christians reach out beyond their own community to break bread with tax collectors, sinners, and outcasts, indeed with the multitudes. May Christian communion stimulate an outpouring of love for others, especially those who suffer today, And just as importantly, an acceptance of love for oneself through communion. May we commemorate the life and death of Jesus the Christ, and then celebrate His true spiritual presence with us, now and every day.